Hello, I'm Todd Johnson, and this is Earlylands in Conversation. For this episode, we go back to Ukraine and to the analyst a great many people in Western capitals turn to first when they want to know what is actually happening on the battlefield. Dr. Jack Watling is Senior Research Fellow for Applied Military Sciences at the Royal United Services Institute in London, and among the most respected analysts of this war. Jack writes regularly for Foreign Affairs and is frequently quoted in leading global media outlets. Jack has spent the past 4.5 years moving between London and Kyiv, and his research method is built on primary discovery, time with Ukrainian units at the front, rather than reassessment of other people's data points. Jack is also the author of Statecraft, The New Rules of Power in a Divided World, published by Macmillan in March, which examines how states actually generate and apply leverage in a fracturing international order. On Ukraine, Jack makes the case that the war has reached a genuine turning point, with Russian forces less capable than they were a year ago, while the Ukrainians have found a defensive concept that works. Yet Jack is careful to explain why that part is not the same thing as a happy ending. Jack also walks through the specific signposts he is watching over the next 6 to 12 months that may point the direction this conflict will take. A note on timing. We recorded this just as the news was breaking out of Kyiv about the replacement of Ukraine's defense minister and the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Jack flags the crisis between civil society and President Zelensky as one of his signposts for the coming months. But the personnel changes were still unfolding when we sat down, so we don't get into the specifics. If you enjoy this and our other episodes, please like and subscribe. We are pleased to welcome Dr. Jack Watling to Earlylands in Conversation. Well, we are very fortunate today to have with us one of the leading analysts of the war in Ukraine, Dr. Jack Watling from the Royal United Services Institute in London. Jack, where are we catching you at today?
I'm for once back in London, which is nice, but usually I'm bouncing between here and Kyiv.
So doing the midnight train or the 13-hour drive from the border, I presume.
Yeah, exactly. Sometimes bus. I've walked across the border a couple of times, so you never know.
There's got to be a book written out there about how to actually get to Kyiv, right? I've done the border a few times too. I've done the bus once, and all of them have severe flaws to the plan.
Well, the one we're really fighting for is the 3.5-hour flight from London to Boryspil, you know? That's the dream.
Jumping on a €100 Ryanair flight would be lovely, right?
Absolutely.
With all the Ryanair baggage associated with it. But give me that baggage over a 4-hour wait in immigration in Poland. So before we get into sort of the topics of the day of Russia and Ukraine and just the broader security and defense dynamics, I want to know how you ended up doing this for a living. What was the path that led you into military analysis?
So I was originally a journalist, mainly doing financial investigations. And I moved from journalism to looking at the financing of non-state actors. And I very quickly found that in order to do that, you need to go out and meet people. And once I started meeting people in that space, people were more interested, clients were more interested in what those groups are doing with the money rather than just where the money came from.
Right.
And so that moved me more and more into looking at security. And I guess it built a methodology for me, which was very much about primary discovery, because I often find that there is a large analytical community, a minority of which get forward and add new information into the conversation. And then there is a large body of the analytical community who are passively receiving information and passing it around. And you often see distortions in that data as it gets shared and distributed because the context in which certain data was collected is lost. And so when I was working in Iraq before I joined RUSI, and a job came up, and I thought it was a real opportunity to be able to combine fieldwork with academic study and make sure that that was packaged in a way that could get to policymakers, which is really the focus of the Institute. So it scratched an itch of my frustrations with journalism, where very often you are writing for such a broad audience that you can't actually get into the detail, or with academia, where the publication cycle is often so long and the governance constraints on fieldwork are so onerous that it's quite difficult to produce policy relevant work in a time frame where it can shape decisions.
Tell us about RUSI itself. How does RUSI differentiate itself from other top-tier think tanks, such as Council on Foreign Relations or IISS? I always think in my mind a strongly defense and military focus, but maybe that's a bit simplistic.
RUSI was founded in 1831 to essentially enable retired military officers to conduct analysis of the future of war. And so to use their experience, but be outside the command structure to provide a different view about operations, what had worked, what hadn't, the impact of technology on how nations fight, from the force development process, which was being, developed, generated in the ministries. RUSI is now an independent charity, so it's no longer part of the Ministry of Defense, but it is under a royal charter. And we still work very closely with the British government. My team, the military sciences team, is focused to that original mission, but we have teams that look at countering proliferation finance, nuclear policy, cyber threats, and other areas, organized crime and policing, counterterrorism, etc. So the work is diversified. But I would say if I was contrasting us with other UK-based think tanks, like Chatham House and AASS, we have royal charters and are therefore strictly non-partisan and academic in our focus. Chatham House is focused on the study of the conduct of foreign policy and diplomacy. IISS does a lot of quant work and also track 2 facilitation. And we do much more qualitative research, operational analysis, and field work. So there's a difference in emphasis between us and IISS, but there's also a lot of complementarity.
Sure. You kind of have your own swim lanes, but you're in the same pool, I guess, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's important to note that DC is a huge ecosystem for these kinds of things, slightly smaller one during the current administration, but nonetheless, in London, military sciences at RUSI is 7 researchers, and IISS, the military studies team, is about 15 people, but a large amount of their annual analytical capacity goes into updating the military balance, which is essentially a tracking inventories of military equipment across armed forces. So the number of people that are doing qualitative concept and operational analysis work in IISS is quite small. So this is a small research community, which means that we collaborate rather than compete.
It's definitely may not be volume, but the quality is certainly high. I want to talk also about your book, Statecraft, which is a wonderful read. The title, could mean so much, right? It could be a primer on international affairs, it could be a textbook, etc. I found it very relevant. Tell us about the book. Tell us about sort of the key takeaways and what led you to write it at the same time that you've been doing so much tactical analysis of the war in Ukraine.
Well, so the book really arose from a sense of deep frustration, as some of these projects do, which was really around a widespread public conversation of intelligence failure, right? And the idea that we got it wrong, which it has become a narrative in response to any foreign policy crisis. And as somebody who has been working directly on many of these issues, whether it be Iran, as I used to do a lot of work on, or Ukraine, I was in Ukraine engaging with Ukrainians before the outbreak of the war. My observation is a bit different, which is that usually the intelligence community got it broadly right, even if the headline higher probability assessment was not consistent with the outcome that actually happened was usually absolutely part of the discussion, very much there as a plausible scenario in a lot of the assessments. And therefore, you would hope that government would have a plan for dealing with that scenario. And yet, whenever these big geopolitical events happened, we would go into crisis mode and government decision-making would become so narrowly focused that we would drop the ball on other things that we had successfully anticipated because there just wasn't the capacity in the system to deal with more than one crisis at a time.
Right.
And so it felt like in spite of all of the investments into intelligence and analysis and deliberate policymaking, long-term strategies and so on that our governments do, we seemed to be failing to exploit that understanding. And the book is an attempt to kind of ask why, identify how this has come about, but also to discuss how we improve that process. And, I didn't want to just kick politicians and say, well, everyone on the intelligence side is correct. And, politicians just are hopeless. And because that's really not true. I think a lot of the problems are around how information is presented, when it is presented to policymakers, and what decisions are actually given to them at what time. So there's a lot of process issues. You need to be successful in using intelligence or research or anticipation in policymaking. You need to have good collection, you need to have good analysis, but you also have to have the ability to convince policymakers that the information you're providing them with is relevant. And very often that's where I think we've fallen down.
You do a brilliant job of highlighting the sort of the reactive nature of so much of foreign policy establishment, particularly in the UK, but certainly the same criticisms can be leveled at Washington as well. And also, I think you do a great job of highlighting sort of lessons learned that can be taken from the middle powers, right? The Finlands, so to speak, of the world and what they're doing right. If you had to point to a certain country, a government, et cetera, that you think has some lessons that we can draw upon, where would you point your finger?
Turkey, which is maybe not the example you were anticipating.
No, that's great though. I love to have a little bit something from left field.
So this isn't a comment on how the Turkish domestic economy or domestic politics is working. But if we look at Turkish foreign policy, right, they are in between the Syrian civil war, Greece, which obviously they have a long-term hostile relationship with, and the Russians. And the Russians are a major historic competitor for the Turks. If we look at, they have threats from terrorism domestically. They have a very, very complicated set of relationships being in NATO, but also needing to, deal with the Iranians very closely and so on and so forth. And as you say, they're a middle power, right? They have quite a lot of people. They have a reasonable amount of industrial capacity, but they have to play smart. They can't squander it. They will feel the pain if they make mistakes. And yet, if we look at how the Syrian civil war has panned out for Turkey, I think you could make a pretty strong case that it's been fairly successful. If you look at their centrality to NATO, they've just hosted the Ankara summit, which was broadly successful for the alliance. And so they have demonstrated at a time when NATO is going through real strain that they add value to the alliance. They are playing a very important role in the Gulf at the moment in conversations around the future of Gulf security in a context where many Gulf states don't necessarily trust that their interests are best protected by decision-making in Washington. And most interestingly of all, they are the only country in the alliance that has, in a declared and open way, killed Russian service personnel several times in the last decade. And yet, I would say, have probably the most mutually respectful relationship with the Russians of any NATO member. And that's not that they're close to the Russians. It's not like Hungary under Orban, where they just see a huge alignment of interest with the Russians. No, the Turks have very, very clear differences of interests with the Russians. And yet they are able to engage with them quite pragmatically in a way that doesn't drive escalation. So I think the Turks are very interesting and are worth studying.
Do they have a uniquely well-suited sort of policy and intelligence establishment that is aligned with their very specific place in the world, specific foreign policy goals? And is that something that they have figured out a way to do much better than, say, London or some of the Western European nations?
I think we often underestimate and overlook Turkish intelligence and also underappreciate the extent of the Turkish diaspora, right? As a form of intelligence collection is the wrong way to think about it because it implies theft of information. But in terms of situational awareness, there is a huge Turkish diaspora stretching all the way to China and people of Turkic origin, right? There's a large Turkish investment structure that goes the whole way through Africa. And obviously many Turks have moved into Europe. And so I think actually they have quite a good handle on the political issues that they're often engaging in. The military is very powerful as an instrument in Turkey. And so it is responsive. And obviously there is a lot of centralization of power around Erdogan. But one of the things that I think is quite interesting is that watching Erdogan engage with someone like Putin, the Russians often felt extremely frustrated when they engaged with principles in Western democracies or the US, because from a Russian point of view, they think, right, if I'm in the room with the decision maker, if they commit to something, then the relationship is going to improve, right? And very often they would have a relatively personable conversation with a Western official or decision maker, and things wouldn't improve. Things would go, that they would leave the room and decisions would be made which would be contrary to what the Russians either thought they had agreed or were different to the mood, essentially, that had been created in the room. This is where you get a lot of Russian conspiracy theories about a Western deep state. And the reason is we don't actually empower. We have, processes that determine what our policies are. We don't actually empower our decision makers to get into the room a lot of the time and make significant decisions. Whereas the Turks don't quite have that disadvantage. Erdogan is able to look someone in the eye, shake someone's hand, and make a decision. Right. And so I think there is an ability to execute against intent there, which builds strategic trust even with adversaries. And that's an interesting dynamic that we have not been able to replicate. At the same time, I think the Turks do have a fairly professional civil service when it comes to foreign policy, and they do delegate, right? I don't see the lines of effort like, let's say, economic development in Mali, where Turks have been very active. I don't see the decision-making being paralyzed by the fact that Erdogan is not actually engaged or involved. People are making decisions. And this is another challenge that I think has become quite chronic in our decision-making, which is that our media and our public discourse assumes that the prime minister, president is on top of every file and therefore can be held responsible for every decision made. And this drives the need to be responsible for every decision, drives the centralization of decision-making, which massively limits the bandwidth the system has to make decisions. You can only make decisions against a small number of issues because you don't have enough time in the day to read across all the issues that government's trying to deal with. Now, I don't want to overstate the point about Turkey. The Turks make plenty of mistakes like everyone else, and there are lots of issues. But in terms of this dynamic of studying middle powers, I think they're interesting.
I'm just thinking, we could have this whole conversation about what the Turks and the Finns and the Poles and others, what they're doing right and what is often missed in the media narrative. But let's shift a bit. And speaking of media narrative, and certainly speaking of Russia, but like I said, you have spent so much of your past 4.5+ years, even more before the war, focused on Ukraine. Ukraine features prominently in the book. The narrative about the war is certainly shifted from 6 months ago, right? In the depths of winter, when it appeared that Kyiv was on its back foot in terms of what the populace was able to endure. And now today, it seems it's a different world. Tell us how much of that you buy into, or is that also a media narrative that just sells well?
I remember back in early 2024 when things were looking very bleak, right? This is after the Ukrainian unsuccessful offensive. The Ukrainians had a lack of reserves, and we could see this continuous stream of Russian recruitment such that the force was growing and growing. And it was very clear on the one hand that the pressure from the Russians was going to build and that it was going to be pretty harsh for some time, for a couple of years. I think the thing that made many of us cautious and very pessimistic in our assessments at the time, noting that the Russians were not performing well on the battlefield. So while there was a huge disparity in forces and means, that wasn't necessarily translating into drastic Russian gains, was that the Russians seemed to have enough mass that if they sorted out some of the problems that were limiting their performance, the situation could get drastically worse. And so we always had to factor into our thinking, what if the Russians fix this list of problems, which seemed within their gift to do. And in the intervening 2 years between 2024 and the beginning of 2026, the Ukrainians have solved some of their problems. They've been very proactive in leaning into an asymmetric way of maximizing the costs to Russia. And the Russians have done very little. In fact, if anything, they've leaned into their worst impulses. They've done very little to address the issues that were limiting their performance. And we are now hitting a point where the Russians are struggling to replace their losses. The quality of the force has degraded quite substantially. And therefore, the dynamic has changed. I'd say Russian forces are less capable than they were a year ago. And Ukrainian forces, by contrast, have turned a corner where they have a concept and they have tested it and it works for how to conduct defensive operations. Now, it is a concept that they struggle to resource in a lot of places, and they have a small proportion of the force that is really capable of fighting in that way. But nonetheless, they have a pathway that they can walk down, which will improve their battlefield performance. And so you put those two things together and you say, well, actually, yeah, we have reached a turning point. The problem that we face is that The Ukrainians are pretty exhausted and they don't have an infinite pool of manpower. And so this can trend in their direction for a period of time, but it can't do so indefinitely. And the second challenge we have, so the need therefore is to make the costs to Russia also be unacceptable if the Russians protract the conflict to the point that the Ukrainians don't feel they can go on. And that's where the deep strike campaign and the growing effectiveness of Ukraine's deep strike campaign is very important. And we also have to acknowledge that the Russians may mobilize, go into mobilization. And if they do that, they can change some of these dynamics. But so far, the Russians have lent into their worst instincts. And I think as an analyst at this point, when I look at the Russian system, I see less capacity to solve some of the problems that they previously could have addressed, which gives me much more confidence that existing trend lines that are favorable to Ukraine will continue. Whereas previously, I had to factor in to all my thinking, what if the Russians do X?
Right.
There are fewer of those currently on the scoreboard, essentially, which is very positive and optimistic. It doesn't mean that we are, inevitably on a trajectory towards a happy ending here, right? Ukraine is going to go through a very, very harsh winter of expanded Russian strikes with less defenses in terms of ballistic missile defense. The Russians still have a lot of firepower, even if it's pretty clumsily applied, and there is still a continual rate of casualties. And I think one of the challenges for those of us who work directly with the Ukrainian armed forces and are close to the issue is that throughout the war, the Ukrainians have classified their own casualty data. There's very good reasons for that, and we've all respected it. But it leads to a conversation in public where a lot of attention is thrown around as to how many casualties the Russians have taken. And there is no discussion of the cost. And if you are not factoring in a significant cost for Ukraine maintaining its resistance in the face of an enemy who has much more firepower than they do, I think that's where we get some of the more outlandishly optimistic takes. It's been a battle throughout this whole process of kind of avoiding councils of euphoria and despair. And far too often the public discourse has jumped from one to the other when actually we are talking about quite subtle shifts in trend.
If you had to give a handful of signposts that you were paying attention to over the next 6 to 12 months, what would they be in terms of where the war is going?
Ukraine has benefited from improving its retention of recruits over the last few months, such that the force has been growing rather than shrinking, which was not the case for the previous 2 years. And a lot of that has been the result of subtle improvements in the training process in some units, but also a belief and a narrative going out to the public around reform and improvement of the conditions of service. When we look at what has happened in 425 Assault Regiment, Scala, where there have been reports of maltreatment of recruits and some pretty unpleasant outcomes. And when we look at the generation of new brigades, for example, when everyone knows that there is a shortage of good commanders, and therefore the ability to provide commanders for new units is a real limiting factor on their performance. So new units rather than consolidation into better units. Which way we go with the Ukrainian armed forces is going to be critical in determining whether that trend of a net positive inflow into the force is sustained. And that has a huge material impact on the performance of Ukrainian forces at the front, especially because it compounds month on month. That's a trend that I pay very close attention to. I think on the Russian side, whether we go into mobilization, which is intended to significantly increase the size of the Russian force, or whether it is mobilization to simply top up the existing recruitment process, is a major indicator of whether the Russians want to escalate the war, do a lot of damage to themselves, but potentially cause a very difficult military situation for Kyiv, or whether they are doing it to simply protract the conflict because they don't want to enter negotiations in a situation where the Ukrainians know if they negotiate and just let it drag on for a while, then the military situation will deteriorate for the Russians. That's a huge indicator. And I think when we look at the rhetoric coming out of the Russian press and the presidential administration not going abroad, but rather domestic messaging, it gives us an indication as to which way the Russians are thinking in this line. But it's hugely consequential. And then I think the third thing is seeing how the current crisis between civil society and Zelensky develops, because it has some major implications in terms of how the Ukrainians intend to fight and whether the improvements that have been made in some units over the last year are going to be nurtured and expanded, or whether we're going to see a reversion. So I think the next month is actually going to be very,
Sure.
very important. Yeah.
Indeed. The lessons learned, I mean, this war in many respects has rewritten the playbook of modern warfare, I think. Those lessons learned are obviously being taken in by Western militaries, but also by the Chinese, the Iranians, and others. But in your engagement with the MODs across NATO and such, are you happy with what they are taking away and how they are incorporating the insights from the war into their own procurement, training, et cetera? Or does it leave a lot to be desired? Or is it country by country?
It's country by country. Some countries essentially use Ukraine as a sorting hat of data points that they can reach into and sort of grab random data points and then use it to justify the thing that they believed anyway, right? Ukraine chose X, Ukraine chose Y. And if someone else pulls something out of the sorting hat that doesn't seem to fit the narrative, then the answer is we wouldn't fight that way. Ukraine is context specific, etc. Right? So we reject the data points we don't like, and we latch on to data points that we do like. And you see these data points being thrown around completely devoid of context. So I think there are some countries where it's just a very cheap reference, right? And it's not being seriously studied. You have other countries where there is a serious desire to learn, but there is also a dearth of reliable or accurate data because they do not have a close cooperative relationship with the Ukrainians. And so the risk is that you learn a lot of false lessons because the divergence between public messaging and how things are actually done is quite wide. There are multiple mechanisms that have now been established to try and improve the data sharing, to improve the lessons processes. And then there are some countries, and I would put the UK in this camp, who have a very, very good relationship with the Ukrainian military, have a very detailed and accurate picture, and are therefore able to identify very precise lessons. But that does not mean that you can easily implement them, because often the implementation is costly and runs up against tradition, institutional inertia, and budget constraints around processes and how money is spent, not necessarily about absolute amounts of funding, but about how it can be used, such that it's really hard. I'll give you a practical example. If you're a Ukrainian infantry soldier today, you're operating in, say, a group of 3 people. 2 of them is covering ground, 1 of them is covering the air, right? To be able to protect that trio from uncrewed systems. Which sounds simple, but if you think about going to a shooting range to practice shooting, if you're practicing engaging targets on the ground at different distances, then from a safety point of view, you need a range, you need some berms, maybe you need some moving targets, but essentially you can implement safety by having controlled arcs of fire. Once you start having a need to train people to scan and engage targets in 360 or a 180-degree dome, essentially, so a hemisphere.
Right.
You have no safety deconfliction lines that are, between you and other people. And the distance that bullet can travel, because you might be firing in the air at 45 degrees, is kilometers and kilometers. So just from a regulatory point of view, actually setting up the infrastructure and procedures to be able to practice training against that problem is a non-trivial issue.
Right now, I'm sure that would give heart palpitations to any range safety officer in any
absolutely.
military.
In any military, right? And you can think about who holds the legal risk and all of this stuff. And in Ukraine, the answer is sometimes people die in training, which, because they have to train people, large numbers of people, and the threat is very real, is a risk they're prepared to take. But actually, from a legal point of view, in peacetime in a lot of European countries, that's not an acceptable answer. So then if you start having to develop technologies that allow you to simulate those kinds of engagements, you've got a lead time, you've got tenders, you've got all this stuff. So even a really basic thing like, how do I teach my soldiers to walk across a field, suddenly becomes this massive regulatory argument. And, we could go through blow by blow and outline how difficult it is to actually integrate those lessons into the day-to-day practice of an army. But it's not simple. So
No, I guess I'm just thinking about the Ajax in the UK Army and all of the trials and tribulations just around internal safety for the crew, right? Around, concussive impacts and things like that. And that seems much more manageable than, like you're saying, uncontrolled fire, with rounds 2 or 3 kilometers from where they were fired. Yeah, it does boggle the mind a little bit, right?
Yeah, and I could go through dozens of examples like that, right? Where there are probably a group of officials somewhere trying to wrestle with, okay, we've identified lessons, we've identified training requirements. How on earth do we make this possible? And now if you're talking about, okay, we need to buy a training area that is 360 and such, think how much land that is. Look at the bill. And so what do I lose in order to spend that money? It's not, these are non-trivial things.
Indeed. Well, let's shift away from the very clinical discussion that we've had. And I'd like to hear how you have changed. I mean, you spent so much time in Ukraine and not just sitting in hotel conference rooms in Kyiv, but out with units on the front line. You have probably grown attached to individuals who have had their own wartime experiences. How has it changed you over the past 4.5 years of deep engagement in this conflict?
In some ways, I'm probably not the right person to ask, strangely enough, right? Because it's a change that has happened through gradually, periodically, it's not something where there was this one particular event that completely changed my outlook. Instead, it's been an everyday experience. But those who interact with me may tell you that there's, I'm a very different person. I don't know. But in terms of things that strike me, and yeah, we'll have to test on a sample of friends and family or whatever, whether I'm right. I think my appreciation of lead times and scale is very different to what it used to be. Before this conflict, most of the issues that I had worked on were sometimes very complex, but fundamentally, we had the capacity to address them within a relatively short space of time. And when you're talking about a conflict of this size, this magnitude, you have to be thinking 8 months out. Anything I spend or try and do now is going to shape the battlefield 6 or 8 months in the future. Not necessarily because that's how long it takes to acquire the thing, but when you look at acquiring it and winning the budget, acquiring it in this volume necessary, shipping it to all the people that need to use it, making sure that all those people are able to use it, and then employing it, there is a really significant lead time to decisions turning into effect. And so my perception of time, I think, has changed as a result of interacting with scale in a very, very different way.
You have watched institutional bureaucracies go through the same transitions, right? The same, impacts of how can we adjust, whatever it may be, from the UK's Joint Intelligence Committee to MOD procurement and such. You've seen that in real time. And I hope there is another book there from you in terms of lessons learned from what you've seen, particularly in NATO nations.
It's a history that will have a pretty long lead time on it, I think, given permissions and confidentiality and that kind of thing. But yeah, there is a book that I do want to write one day, which is looking at kind of the decision points, the major decision points in the war, not turning points on the battlefield, the key arguments around certain decisions that were extremely contentious.
Oh.
I think you could probably write it in like 12 episodes of major decisions, like three per year or whatever. But yeah, we're going to have to wait until this settles before that can be written.
We're fast approaching the end, my friend, unfortunately. But let's take a step back from Ukraine, because like you said, you have been looking at conflicts in Iran. We could certainly have the same good discussion about what we are witnessing in the Strait of Hormuz right now. If you can explain that to me, Jack, that would be wonderful. But more broadly, trend lines in terms of the world of defense analysis and just the world of security policy. What excites you about the next 5, 10, 15 years? What are you watching? Of course, you could say probably the rise of autonomous combat systems, weapon systems, and others, but that may be a bit too easy. What are some other trend lines that you were really interested and focused on beyond just the battlefield dynamics, say in Ukraine or the Strait of Hormuz?
I think supply chains and how governments look at security and resilience in the context of their economic relationships. because economic efficiency drives you towards globalization. It drives you towards trying to have as large a market as possible. But that is a very fragile and system and lacks resilience. And what we are seeing, I think, is a world where countries are becoming much more aggressive in weaponizing their control within supply chains, such that you need to be really, really conscious of your exposure in foreign policy. And so I think we're going to start seeing many more national strategies which identify where countries are prepared to take that exposure risk and where they will accept significant penalties in terms of economic efficiency to avoid it. And that drives you towards protectionism. It also means that you start seeing the fragmentation of the world, right? It's not just deglobalization, it's also the erection of firewalls between countries, whether that be as a result of sanctions or other mechanisms that become serious barriers to trade. So I think that is a trend that has huge implications in terms of where power sits, no country can be completely autarkic. So you don't have the choice of just cutting yourself off. The question is, where are you going to accept the risk? And what does that mean in terms of who you consider to be your friends? I think that's a major debate that is only just getting started. I think that there is a fascinating trend when it comes to, I'd say, a grouping of issues. You could put artificial intelligence in the space and our growing dependency on space, both to be competitive, but also just in terms of how our national infrastructure works, disease control, and I'd put climate change and climate mitigation in there as well, as a grouping of issues that we have to address multilaterally, right? Because no one has control of space. We're all sharing the environment. Disease is not very respectful of borders. And AI is an area which, very rapidly has disruptive effects beyond one economy. And so these are areas where we're going to have to collaborate and compete. But how we think about collaboration or multilateralism is going to be interesting, because at the moment, I think a lot of our post-World War II multilateral structures are breaking down. That is having a pretty deleterious effect on our ability to collectively solve problems. It drives people to zero-sum thinking. But there are a group of issues out there which are not zero-sum. And, we all either win or lose. And so within that context, how do we construct a multilateral framework which can function for addressing those issues, even as the world becomes more fractured? I think that's a really interesting area to study.
These go to a lot of the themes that are in Statecraft as well, right? The supply chain point I thought was brilliant. African governments, for example, wanted to do beneficiation of minerals at home, but how does that work with defense supply chains and other such things? So much to unpack there, my friend. But yes, we are reaching the end here, and we always end every episode, no matter what it is, no matter who the guest is. We ask them for 1 to 2 books that they would recommend for the nightstand of our listeners. And we have had those directly relevant to, the war in Ukraine, or just great novels that have been on the nightstand of some of the guests. What would you recommend for summer reading, particularly going into the August holidays?
One would be Seeing Like a State, which I think is, irrespective of whether you agree or disagree with the specific examples that the book addresses, it essentially looks at how states measure problems and how they require measurements for problems in order to make collective decisions. But the process of making problems legible and measurable has a significant impact in defining the limitations of our understanding of a problem, especially a complex problem. And I think it's a very interesting lens to use to examine decision-making and how we can kind of box ourselves in to a framework of decision-making around an issue, which is sometimes very helpful for getting things done and also sometimes quite counterproductive.
And that's Seeing Like a State by James Scott, right?
Yeah. And then I think a second book, one of the fun books that I quite like to dip into sometimes is Ashenden, which people may have, by Somerset Maugham, which people may or may not have read. Yeah. It's fun. It's fun. It's
sort of kind of early 20th century spy novel, right?
Yeah, it's one of the very early spy novels, and very much rooted in his experience during the First World War. I mean, firstly, I'd say people should read it because it's enjoyable, and beautifully written. But secondly, when you look at so many of the issues and dynamics at play in it, it just reminds you that it's ironic because the book Statecraft that you've mentioned has the subtitle, The New Rules of Power in a Divided World. And I think a more accurate title would probably be The Rules of Power in a Newly Divided World, right? These rules have existed for a long time. And so it's useful for us to remember that our ancestors have tackled many of the same issues.
Those are great recommendations. We'll put those in the show notes, of course. Jack, thank you so much, my friend. Like I said, I always say this, but this one in particular, I think we could have gone on for another 2 to 3 hours, sort of Joe Rogan-esque podcast here that just keeps going, right? But I wish we had the time to do it. So thank you very much for chatting with us today. And the book,
been a pleasure.
The book again is Statecraft by Dr. Jack Watling from the Royal United Services Institute, and I can't recommend it more highly. If you're looking to have a few aha moments on the beach this August, I think this is definitely the book for you. So, Jack, thank you for taking the time.
No, thank you, and hopefully next time our paths will cross in Kyiv.